I paid rent for 25 years, and the hardest part was not the money, it was the way people looked at me, like I had somehow failed at life, like I had stopped moving forward while everyone else kept climbing. Last Thanksgiving, my son leaned back in his chair, looked around his new house, and said, "Mom, you should have bought something years ago. Renting this long is just throwing money away." I smiled and nodded, just like I always did, because he had no idea what those 25 years really looked like. He didn't see the nights I stayed up balancing a checkbook down to the last dollar. He didn't see me working double shifts at the bank during the day and cleaning offices at night just to make sure the rent was always paid on time. He didn't see the envelopes, the quiet system I built for myself, one for bills, one for emergencies, one that I never touched no matter what happened. Even when my car broke down on a freezing January morning and I had to take 2 buses just to get to work. Even when my friends invited me on vacations I couldn't afford, even when my own family assumed I just didn't have ambition, I let them believe that. I let everyone believe that I was stuck, because explaining it would have ruined the plan. And the plan was simple: survive first, then build. I remember the apartment clearly: 620 square feet, second floor, windows that rattled every winter, the same place my son grew up in. The same place people whispered about when they compared lives. "She's still there," they would say, "still renting," like it was a label that defined everything about me. But what they didn't see was that every month, after the rent was paid, after groceries, after gas, there was always something left. Not much at first, sometimes just $50, sometimes $100, but it went into that third envelope, the one no one knew about. Over time, that envelope turned into an account, and that account turned into something else entirely. I didn't talk about it. I didn't celebrate it. I just kept going year after year, through layoffs, through a failed attempt at opening a small bookkeeping business that cost me nearly $12,000, through moments where it would have been easier to give up and just live paycheck to paycheck like everyone expected me to. But I didn't. I adjusted. I learned. I read everything I could about money, about investing, about how people quietly built wealth without anyone noticing, and slowly, things began to change, not on the outside, not in a way anyone could see. My car was still old, my apartment still small, my life still looked exactly the same to everyone else, but underneath it all, something was growing. Something steady, something patient, something that didn't need approval or validation. So when my son said those words that night, when he assumed that renting for 25 years meant I had nothing to show for it, I didn't correct him, I didn't explain. I just took a sip of my coffee and let the silence sit between us, because some truths don't need to be argued, they just need time. And what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were watching where I lived, I was building something far bigger than a house, something they would never expect until the moment I decided to let them see it. The truth is, I did not start with a plan to build anything impressive. I started with fear. Real quiet fear that sat in my chest every time the first of the month came around. I remember one winter when the rent went up by $80 and I sat at my kitchen table for nearly 2 hours just staring at the notice, calculating and recalculating, wondering what I could cut, what I could live without, because there was no one else to fall back on, no second income, no safety net, just me and a responsibility I could not afford to fail. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not dramatically, not all at once, just a small decision that I would never let money control me that way again. So I began to watch everything, every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. I stopped buying things I did not truly need. I learned how to stretch a grocery budget for an entire week. I made simple meals, rice, vegetables, chicken when it was on sale, and I stopped thinking about what I wanted and started focusing on what would last. My coworkers would talk about new cars and weekend trips, and I would listen, smile, and keep my own thoughts to myself, because what I was building did not look impressive on the outside. It looked like sacrifice. It looked like staying home. It looked like saying no more often than yes. There were nights when I came home exhausted from work and still forced myself to sit down and learn, reading about savings accounts, retirement plans, investment basics, words that used to feel distant and Complicated slowly became familiar, and with that familiarity came confidence, not loud confidence, but a steady kind that grows quietly over time. I made mistakes too. I trusted the wrong advice once and lost nearly $3,000 in something I did not fully understand, and that loss hurt more than I expected, not just financially but mentally, because it made me question whether I was capable of doing this at all. But instead of stopping, I went back and studied harder. I learned why I lost that money, I learned what to avoid, and I promised myself that every mistake would be a lesson I paid for only once. Over the years, my income slowly increased, not dramatically, but enough, small raises, better positions, more stable hours. And every time my income went up, I did not change my lifestyle. I changed where the extra money went. I increased what I saved, what I invested, what I quietly set aside for a future no one else could see. The apartment stayed the same, the routine stayed the same, and to anyone looking from the outside, nothing about my life suggested progress. But that was the point. I was not building something for them to notice. I was building something for me to rely on, something steady. Something that would not disappear with one bad month or one unexpected expense, and year after year, without announcements, without recognition, that invisible structure kept growing, piece by piece, stronger than anything they could measure. Just by looking at where I lived by the time 10 years had passed, I had learned something most people never talk about. Progress does not always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like staying exactly where you are while everything inside your life is quietly changing. I still walked the same hallway every evening, still unlocked the same apartment door, still parked the same car in the same spot, and to anyone watching, it probably looked like nothing had moved forward at all. But what they could not see was how differently I thought, how differently I handled every decision. Money was no longer something that came and went without purpose. It had direction. It had intention. Every dollar had a job before it even arrived. And that changed everything. I remember one afternoon at work when a younger coworker asked me why I never upgraded my lifestyle. She had just bought a new car, bright red, still smelled like leather, and she laughed lightly as she said, "You have been here longer than me. Why are you still living like that?" I smiled the same way I always did and told her I liked things simple, and that was not entirely a lie. Simplicity had become my advantage. The less I needed, the more I could keep. And the more I could keep, the more control I had over my future. But control is not something people notice right away. They notice appearances. They notice what is visible, and for a long time, what was visible about my life looked unchanged. Even my son, as he got older and started building his own life, began to see things through that same lens. He worked hard, bought his first house with a loan, talked about interest rates and monthly payments with pride, and I was proud of him too, but I could feel the quiet comparison forming, not from cruelty, just from misunderstanding. He saw ownership as a finish line and renting as something you were supposed to grow out of, and I understood why he thought that, because that is what everyone is taught. What no one teaches is that ownership without stability can be just as fragile as renting without a plan. I had seen people stretch themselves too thin, take on more than they could handle, and spend years trying to keep up with something they were not ready for. I chose a different path. One that required patience most people are not willing to practice. During those years, I began to take small steps that no one else noticed. I opened my first investment account with money that took years to accumulate. I remember staring at the screen before making that first transfer, not because it was a large amount, but because it represented trust in a process I had worked hard to understand. From there, things began to move slowly but steadily. Not in a way that changed my daily life, but in a way that changed my long-term direction. Dividends came in quietly, balances grew gradually, and over time, what once felt small began to compound into something meaningful. I did not celebrate it. I did not talk about it. I simply kept going, month after month, year after year, building something that did not need to be seen to be real, and the more it grew, the more I realized something important. I was no longer working just to pay rent. I was working to buy time, and time, more than anything else, was the one thing I had never truly had before. As the years continued to pass, something else began to change, not just in my finances, but in the way I understood security, because for most of my life, security had always meant having just enough to get through the next month, just enough to cover rent, just enough to avoid falling behind. But now, for the first time, I was starting to feel something different, something steadier. Not because my life looked different on the outside, but because I knew exactly what was happening beneath the surface. I remember the first time I realized I was no longer living paycheck to paycheck. It was a quiet moment. Nothing dramatic, just me sitting at my kitchen table going over my accounts like I always did, and noticing that for the first time, if something unexpected happened, I would be ready, not just barely, but comfortably. And that realization did not make me excited. It made me calm, a kind of calm I had never experienced before, because it meant that all those years of saying no, all those nights of staying in, all those small sacrifices that no one ever noticed, had finally created something real. Around that same time, I began to think differently about opportunities. Before, I avoided risk completely because I could not afford mistakes, but now I started to understand the difference between reckless decisions and calculated ones. And that opened a door I had never stepped through before. I began looking at properties, not to live in, but to understand them, to study the numbers, the costs, the potential. I would spend weekends driving through neighborhoods, noticing details most people overlooked, for rent signs, small duplexes, older buildings that needed work. I was not ready yet, but I was preparing, learning how value was created over time, not overnight. There were moments when doubt still crept in, when I questioned whether I had waited too long, whether starting this late meant I had missed my chance, especially when I saw people my age already settled into homes they had owned for years. But then I would remind myself of something I had learned the hard way: timing only matters if you never start, and I had already started, just in a way no one else recognized. During this period, my son visited more often, and I could see how his perspective continued to evolve. He talked about repairs, about maintenance, about the responsibilities that came with ownership, and I listened carefully, not because I needed advice, but because I was observing, understanding what ownership actually required beyond the surface. And it became clear to me that what I was building was not just about reaching a number. It was about being ready for what came next. I did not want to own something I could not sustain. I wanted stability that would last. So I kept going the same way I always had: steady, quiet, intentional, saving, learning, preparing. Until one day, without any announcement or celebration, I realized I had crossed a line I had been moving toward for years. I was no longer just someone who rented and saved. I was someone who had the ability to choose what came next, and that kind of freedom does not show up in a title or a label. It shows up in the silence, in the confidence of knowing you are ready, even if no one else sees it yet. The moment finally came in a way that felt almost ordinary, which is how most important changes happen, not with an announcement or a dramatic turning point, but quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon, after work, when I was reviewing listings the same way I had done for months, scanning numbers, comparing neighborhoods, looking for something that made sense not emotionally but financially. And then I saw it, a small duplex on the edge of a neighborhood that most people overlooked. Not perfect, not new, but stable. The kind of property that did not attract attention but held value in ways that were not immediately obvious. I studied it carefully, ran the numbers again and again, calculating rent potential, maintenance costs, taxes, everything I had trained myself to consider over the years, and for the first time, the numbers did not just make sense. They aligned with everything I had built, everything I had prepared for. I remember sitting there for a long time, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what this decision meant. It was not just a purchase, it was a transition. From preparation to action, from waiting to stepping forward, and that kind of step requires a different kind of confidence. Not loud or impulsive, but steady and earned. I made the call the next morning, spoke calmly asked the questions I needed to ask, and moved forward without hesitation. The process itself was not glamorous: paperwork, inspections, conversations, details that most people find overwhelming, but to me, it felt familiar. Because I had spent years preparing for it without even realizing how much that preparation would matter, there were moments during that time when doubt tried to return, small thoughts questioning whether I was making the right move, whether something unexpected would go wrong, but each time those thoughts appeared, I answered them with facts, with everything I had learned, with the discipline that had carried me this far, and I kept going, step by step, until the day came when everything was finalized. And I sat in a quiet office signing papers that represented more than just ownership. They represented years of invisible effort finally taking form. I did not celebrate that day. I did not call anyone or make an announcement. I simply went home, walked into the same apartment I had lived in for so long, and sat down at the same kitchen table where all of this had started. The difference was not in the space around me. It was in the understanding that I was no longer limited by it. Over the next few weeks, I began managing that property carefully, learning in real time what it meant to own something responsibly, handling repairs, communicating with tenants, making decisions that required both patience and clarity, and what surprised me most was not how difficult it was, but how natural it felt, as if all those years of observation and restraint had prepared me for this exact moment. Nothing about my daily life changed dramatically. I still woke up early, still went to work, still lived quietly, but underneath that routine, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just building for the future. I had stepped into it, and for the first time, the life I had been creating in silence was beginning to exist in a way that did not need explanation, because it was real. Owning that first property did not change my life overnight, and that was the part no one ever talks about, because people expect a moment like that to feel like a finish line. But in reality, it felt like the beginning of a new kind of responsibility, one that required the same discipline that got me there in the first place, just applied in a different way. I quickly learned that ownership was not about pride. It was about consistency. Small decisions made over and over again, making sure things were maintained, making sure the numbers still worked, making sure nothing was ignored just because it seemed minor at the time. There were weeks when a repair would come up unexpectedly, something simple like plumbing or electrical. And instead of reacting with stress the way I would have years ago, I handled it calmly, because I had built a system that could absorb those moments. That was the real difference, not the absence of problems, but the ability to handle them without everything falling apart. Over time, the property began to stabilize, the rent came in regularly, expenses became predictable, and I could finally see the structure I had imagined for so many years starting to hold its shape. It was not dramatic. It did not look impressive from the outside, but it was solid, and solid was something I had worked a long time to achieve. During that period, I continued to live exactly the same way, in the same apartment, with the same routines, and that confused people even more, because now, without realizing it, I had stepped into something they believed should immediately change my lifestyle, but I did not change anything, because I understood something they did not. Growth is fragile in the beginning, and protecting it matters more than displaying it, so I stayed consistent, kept saving, kept learning, and slowly the results began to compound in ways that were no longer just theoretical. I started to see how one stable asset could lead to another opportunity, how patience could create options that did not exist before, and that realization shifted my focus again, not toward spending or upgrading my life, but toward expanding what I had built. I began to look at other opportunities with a clearer perspective, not chasing anything, just evaluating what made sense, what aligned with the discipline I had developed. There was no urgency, no pressure to move quickly, because I had already proven to myself that time was not my enemy, it was my advantage. My son continued to visit, and I could see how his understanding of my life had not changed. He still saw the same apartment, the same routines, and assumed everything else remained the same, and I let him think that, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I had learned that not every truth needs to be explained before it is understood. Sometimes it is better to let time reveal things in its own way, and as I sat at that same kitchen table one evening, going over my numbers like I had done for years. I realized something. That felt both simple and powerful. I was no longer trying to escape a life of renting. I had already built something far more important. I had built control, and once you have that, everything else becomes a matter of choice. Not survival. What I did next was not something anyone around me would have expected, because from the outside, nothing about my life suggested expansion. It suggested stability at best. Maybe even stagnation to those who only measured progress by visible upgrades. But I had reached a point where I no longer needed external validation to move forward. I had numbers. I had experience, and more importantly, I had patience. So when another opportunity appeared, I recognized it immediately, not because it looked impressive, but because it made sense in the quiet way I had trained myself to understand. It was another small property, not far from the first one, similar in structure, similar in potential, and most people would have overlooked it for the same reasons they overlooked the first. It was not new. It did not stand out. It required attention, and attention is something most people avoid when it does not come with immediate reward. I approached it the same way I approached everything else, slowly, carefully, running every number more than once, considering every possible outcome. Not hoping for success, but preparing for it, and when I moved forward with that second purchase, it did not feel like a risk. It felt like a continuation of something I had already proven I could handle. The process was smoother this time, not because it was easier, but because I was different, more certain, more focused, less influenced by doubt, and as that second property began to take shape under my management, I started to see patterns more clearly, how systems could be repeated, how discipline could be scaled, how something small could grow without losing its stability, and that understanding changed the way I saw everything, not just opportunities, but time itself, because now, instead of thinking in terms of months or even years, I began thinking in terms of long-term cycles. What would this look like in 5 years, in 10? What would consistency produce if I simply stayed on the path I had already built? And the answers to those questions were not exciting in the way people expect success to be. They were steady, predictable, quiet, but they were real, and that mattered more than anything else. My son still visited, still saw the same apartment, still made the same assumptions, and I noticed something subtle beginning to shift in his tone, not disbelief, but curiosity. Small questions about how I managed things, how I stayed so consistent, how I seemed unaffected by the financial pressures he often talked about. I answered simply, never explaining more than necessary. Because I knew that understanding cannot be given all at once, it has to be recognized over time, and I was not in a hurry to prove anything, not to him, not to anyone, because what I had built was no longer something fragile that needed protection. It was something stable. Something that could stand on its own, and as I sat once again at that same kitchen table, reviewing numbers that now told a very different story than they had years ago, I realized that the life I had created did not look different on the surface. But beneath it, everything had changed, and the most powerful part of that change was not the growth itself. It was the fact that it had happened without noise, without attention, without anyone noticing until it was already real. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind that feels ordinary until it is not. My son had invited me over for dinner, nothing special, just a quiet meal in the house he was proud of, the house he had worked hard to buy, and I respected that. I always had. We sat at the table, talking about small things at first, work, the weather, repairs he needed to handle, and I listened the same way I always did, calmly, without interruption, because I had learned long ago that listening reveals more than speaking. As the conversation continued, he began talking about finances again, about rising costs, about how difficult it was to stay ahead even when you did everything right, and then, almost casually, he looked at me and said something that carried more weight than he realized. He said, "I just do not understand how you stayed in the same place all those years. Renting like that, it must have set you back. You could have owned something by now." The room went quiet for a moment. Not because of tension, but because of the space his words created. I looked at him, not with frustration, not with the need to correct him immediately, but with the same calm I had carried for years, because this moment was not new to me. It was simply the first time it had been spoken so directly. I took a breath, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, and I said something I had never said out loud before. Not to him, not to anyone. I said, "I do own something." He smiled slightly, thinking I meant something small, something modest, and he nodded as if to encourage me, but I continued, slowly, without emphasis, without any need to prove anything. I explained that over the years I had been saving, investing, building quietly, that I had purchased properties, that I had created income streams that did not depend on a single paycheck. I did not list numbers. I did not describe everything in detail. I simply told him the truth in its simplest form. And for the first time, I saw something change in his expression, not disbelief, but realization, the kind that takes a moment to settle, because it requires you to reframe everything you thought you understood. He sat back in his chair, silent for a few seconds, processing what I had said, and then he asked questions, not challenging, not defensive, just trying to understand. How long, how, when, and I answered calmly, the same way I always approach things, without emotion. Without exaggeration, just facts, steady and clear. I could see it in his eyes, the shift from assumption to awareness, from seeing me as someone who stayed in one place to someone who had been moving forward the entire time in a way he had never considered. There was no dramatic reaction, no apology, no sudden change in tone, just a quiet recognition that what he had believed about my life was incomplete, and that was enough, because I had never needed him to see it earlier. I only needed to know that it was real, and as the conversation moved on, back to ordinary things, something subtle had changed between us, not in a way that required acknowledgement, but in a way that could not be undone. Because once the truth is understood, even quietly, it reshapes everything that comes after it. After that evening, nothing around me changed in a visible way, and that was what made it so powerful. I still returned to the same apartment, still unlocked the same door, still sat at the same kitchen table where every decision of my life had quietly taken shape, but something inside me had settled in a way it never had before, not because anyone finally understood, but because I no longer needed them to. The truth had been spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, and once something is clear, it does not need to be repeated. In the weeks that followed, my son began to ask different kinds of questions, not about why I stayed in one place, but about how I thought about money, about time, about choices, and I answered the same way I always had, simply, without trying to impress or explain more than necessary. Because I knew that the value of what I had built was not in the numbers themselves, it was in the discipline that created them, and that is something no one can fully understand until they practice it themselves. I noticed something else too, something quieter. The way he listened changed. The way he spoke changed, not out of guilt or regret, but out of recognition, and recognition is different. It does not ask for correction. It simply adjusts what was once assumed. I did not need an apology. I did not need acknowledgement, because I had never built my life for approval. I built it so I would never have to depend on it. Over time, my routine remained the same. I continued managing what I had, continued reviewing numbers, continued making decisions the same way I always had, carefully, patiently, without rushing into anything that did not align with what I had learned. Opportunities still appeared, some I took, some I passed on, but every choice came from a place of stability, not pressure. And that made all the difference, because when you are no longer trying to prove anything, your decisions become clearer, simpler, more aligned with what actually matters. There was a moment one evening, not long after that dinner, when I sat alone with a cup of coffee, looking over everything I had built, not in detail, not counting every number, just understanding it as a whole, and I realized something that felt both quiet and complete. I had spent years being seen as someone who stayed in the same place, someone who never moved forward, someone who never reached what others considered success, but in reality, I had been moving the entire time, just not in a way that demanded attention. I had built something steady, something real, something that could support me without needing to be explained or justified, and that was enough, more than enough, because in the end, it was never about owning a house or proving a point. It was about building a life where I had choices. where I had control, where I was not reacting to circumstances, but shaping them quietly over time. And that kind of life does not need to be seen to be understood. It simply needs to be lived.